On debate, Senator Cormier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, I rise today to speak at second reading on Bill S-208, entitled An Act Respecting the Declaration of the Essential Role of Artists and Creative Expression in Canada. I would like to acknowledge that the lands from which I'm speaking are part of the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and as the Canada Council for the Arts states, I strongly believe that the arts contribute to the process of healing and decolonization, and that we must all work together towards achieving this goal.
I would like to congratulate Senator Bovey for introducing this ambitious bill on November 24, with the Minister of Canadian Heritage preparing to hold a national summit on the recovery of the arts, culture, and heritage sectors. Now is the time for an important and long-awaited discussion on the place and role of the arts and culture in Canadian society. I would also like to thank Senator Atula-Jan for shedding light on the precarious working conditions of artists and cultural workers in her second reading speech, a subject matter that also concerns me a lot. Bill S-208 creates a declaration on the essential role of artists and creative expression and provides a framework for its implementation in the form of an action plan. The action plan is to be developed by the Minister of Canadian Heritage following consultations with other federal ministers and stakeholders, including but not limited to those listed in the bill. Although I applaud the bill's overarching objectives, I want to share with you colleagues my thoughts and concerns about the following aspects which could be addressed in committee. The lack of attention in the bill to the collective dimension of Canadian culture and the importance of protecting and promoting the diversity of Canadian cultural expressions, the place of this bill within federal jurisdiction, the link that this bill could make between culture and sustainable development, the challenges of developing the proposed action plan and holding consultation to ensure its implementation, and lastly, the merits of this bill at a time when artists are facing great uncertainty.
At the outset, it seems fundamental to me to recognize that a declaration that addresses the essential role of artists and creative expression across Canada must take into account the cultural ecosystems in which artists practice their art and the social groups of which they are part. In other words, taking into account the collective dimension of Canadian culture and its plurality is essential to understanding the issues affecting artists in Canada. This dimension is not given much emphasis in the current version of the bill. Allow me to remind you of the UNESCO definition of this dimension of culture, and I quote, "In its broadest sense, culture can today be regarded as the set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of society or a social group, and it encompasses, in addition to art and literature, human lifestyles, ways of living together, value systems, fundamental human rights, traditions, and beliefs," end quotes. Beyond this definition, by ratifying the 2005 UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions, Canada has committed to creating an environment within its territory that encourages individuals and social groups to create, produce, disseminate, distribute, and have access to their own cultural expressions. To this end, Canada is committed, and I stress, to taking due account of the various social groups, including minorities and Indigenous peoples.
As you know, colleagues, the Canadian identity is anything but homogeneous. It is the product of culturally different social groups, majorities and minorities, all coexisting in this country. It stems from our historical context, the evolution of Canadian society, the cultural development of our vast territory, and the choices we make. In that sense, I'm pleased that Bill S-208 pays special attention to Indigenous peoples in its preamble and consultations provisions. The preamble specifically states that, and I quote, "Any measures to implement the declaration in Canada must take into account the diversity of Indigenous peoples and in particular the diversity of the identities, cultures, languages, customs, and practices of First Nations, the Inuit and the Métis, and of their relationships to the land and their indigenous knowledge, all of which find expression in rich artistic traditions, end of quote. Yet I wonder whether this clause in the preamble and the consultation provisions with Indigenous artists and organizations prior to developing the action plan are enough. We ought to hear the views of our Indigenous colleagues in the Senate, especially as we work to advance Indigenous self-determination, which is recognized in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Now, regarding the declaration as such, I note the intention to include the individual cultural specificities and origins of all Canadians, which is a priori positive. However, I wonder how this bill, in its implementation, will be able to address each of them, and above all, how it will embody our collective cultural dimension in all its plurality and complexity. For example, how will the action plan respond to the needs of Indigenous peoples, Acadians, Quebecers, official language minority communities, and ethnocultural minorities? Each of these cultural entities that embody the Canadian identity has its own cultural expression that must be promoted and protected. Moreover, each of these entities in which artists create and meet their audiences unfolds within a set of infrastructures, organizations, and cultural enterprises that are interrelated and inseparable and must be taken into account if we want to take concrete action to improve the status of artists and accessibility to their works. In my opinion, it would be therefore desirable for this bill to give greater recognition to the collective and plural dimension of Canadian culture, however complex it may be, and to reiterate the importance of protecting and promoting the cultural expressions of the various social groups that make up our country and provide for a clear obligation to work towards this.
It must also be examined through the lens of jurisdiction within the Canadian Federation. Cultural matters, including access, participation, and learning, generally fall under the legislative authority of the provinces and territories, with some exceptions. With that in mind, and given that the bill affects rights that fall under provincial and territorial jurisdiction, for example, the right to learn any art form or the right to access creation spaces, I wonder how this bill will be received by the provinces and territories. Although Clause 4 in Bill S-208 provides for consultations with provincial representatives, what will be the true nature of this collaboration? How will the federal government improve on what these legislators have already put in place in terms of policies, while considering the specific cultural development of each province and territory? These questions need further assessment, I think.
Colleagues, this is by no means to suggest that the federal government has less responsibility for culture than the provinces and territories. It's clear that broadcasting, copyright, intellectual property, support for our major national cultural institutions, and many other matters fall under federal jurisdiction. I believe, however, that the federal government's actions in cultural matters within its jurisdiction could be better oriented towards sustainable development and thus better respect the commitment it made when it ratified the UNESCO Declaration on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. In its current form, Bill S-208 does not clearly make this link between culture and sustainable development. However, it seems to me that by doing so, it could bring real added value to our Canadian cultural policy, thus helping to propel culture more appropriately within the federal government. Let you remind me that Article 13 of UNESCO Convention states, and I quote, "Parties shall endeavour to integrate culture in their development policies at all levels for the creation of conditions conducive to sustainable development, and within this framework, foster aspects related to the protection and promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions," end quote. As you know, colleagues, sustainable development is defined as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. According to this approach, any decision aimed at growth should take into account the economic, environmental, and social pillars. What the UNESCO Convention adds is that culture, without being a pillar of sustainable development, is a vector of it, and that we should strive to better integrate it into our policies for a better sustainable development, without forgetting that this relationship is mutual, that indeed culture participates in sustainable development, but that its vitality also benefits greatly. To date, Canada has a panoply of laws, regulations, programs, subsidies, and other financial incentives for the arts and culture sector. In 2017, a Canadian cultural policy to stimulate economic growth of Canadian cultural industries in the digital age was even launched. However, if we are trying to find a framework in Canada that encompasses all of these initiatives and offers a clear cross-cutting vision of the Canadian arts and culture sector as a vehicle for sustainable development, for the benefit of artists and the public, the answer is less clear.
Bovey's remarks in her speech at second reading that Canada should better integrate arts and culture into all its policies, programs, and investments, and that it's time for us to refocus on various international conventions, including the UNESCO Convention on the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. How will Bill S-208 contribute to the realignment of Canadian cultural policy with the UNESCO Convention in terms of protecting the diversity of cultural expressions and integrating culture into sustainable development? That is less clear for me right now. Bill S-208 contains many promising and inclusive clauses, which I applaud, but it does not clearly identify strategic areas of sustainable development to which culture could contribute and benefit. In my view, the bill could be strengthened by explicitly adding these considerations in its text.
I would now like to address the challenges of developing the proposed action plan and consultation process placed under the central authority of the Minister of Canadian Heritage. While aware of the laudable intentions mentioned in Senator Bovey's second reading speech, that is, that the declaration become the cornerstone of ongoing policy development in multiple departments, I question the feasibility of this objective. I'm concerned that the mechanism in Bill S-208, which centralizes responsibility solely in the hands of the Minister of Canadian Heritage, will simply perpetuate the operations already in place. Knowing that this department has no power to impose actions on other departments, it seems to me that we must think outside the box here.
The arts and culture sector are interwoven areas and cannot be considered in complete isolation from one another. In this sense, and from a sustainable development perspective, is it not time for a paradigm shift where a shared cultural responsibility could be given to several strategic federal departments in collaboration with major cultural institutions such as the Canada Council for the Arts? Instead of a consultation process as set out in the bill, should we not take a more innovative approach of co-creation and proactive partnerships? There's a lot to think about here. J'aimerais terminer, collègues.
I would like to conclude, colleagues, by reiterating the basic principle that the vitality of the arts and culture sector depends on the artists and workers who make it tick. There's no art without artists, of course. Yet the precariousness of their working conditions is very real. Calls for the creation of a better social safety net for artists and cultural workers are growing, and hence the urgent need for action. This is not, unfortunately, a new situation. In a 1980 recommendation on the status of the artists, UNESCO already noted the worrying situation of artists and prescribed a series of measures to its member states aimed at improving their professional, social, and economic conditions. This recommendation is similar in many respects to the rights of the artist listed in the Declaration on the Essential Role of Artists and Creative Expression in Canada, created by Bill S-208, and I sincerely thank Senator Bovey for reminding us of these rights. That being said, however, as some of the organization and individuals consulted have told me, one has to wonder whether new declaratory tools such as the one proposed in Bill S-208 is really what artists need at this time to reiterate their right to employment equity and economic security. It begs the question of whether the implementation of Bill S-208 through its action plan will really result in better social protection for artists. This is another question to be explored.
Colleagues, despite my concerns and thoughts with some aspects of the bill today, I strongly believe that Bill S-208 should be thoroughly studied in committee, and I'm really looking forward to it. We could hear from important witnesses, such as the Minister of Canadian Heritage, provincial representatives, Crown corporations, and organizations representing artists, so that we can get their insight and expertise. Senator Bovey has done a tremendous...
Excuse me, Senator Cormier, your time is up. Would you like 5 more minutes? Yes, if possible.
If you're opposed, please say no. Senator Cormier.
Thank you.
Senator Cormier.
To thank Senator Bovey. Senator Bovey has done a tremendous amount of work in identifying the measures that need to be taken to make sure that the essential role of artists and creative expression is fully recognized and taken into account in our country. I would like to conclude by thanking her again for her dedication, passion, and courage in introducing this ambitious bill. I appreciate her sincere intentions, which reflect her deep commitment to the arts, culture, and heritage in Canada.
I want to thank her colleagues for challenging us to reflect on the place of arts and culture in Canada. With this bill, Senator Bovey is initiating an exciting and necessary debate that deserves the interest and diligence of this upper chamber. We look forward to a committee study. Thank you.